The heart monitor in resuscitation room 3 of Perm City Hospital number 4 had been screaming for 4 minutes when the nurse began counting compressions out loud. 87, 88, 89. She counted because someone had to, because when a human heart stops, the body doesn't wait for anyone to process what's happening. It simply begins to die, one cell cluster at a time, starting from the edges and moving inward, and the only thing standing between that process and completion is a pair of hands pressing down hard enough to crack ribs, over and over, without stopping. The young man on the gurney was 24 years old. He weighed 58 kilograms. 8 months ago he had weighed 71. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The team in that room had seen bad nights before. Perm is not a small city. 1 million people, a full trauma ward, a psychiatric unit that runs at 130% capacity most winter months. They had seen overdoses. They had seen young people brought in blue, barely breathing, with pupils fixed so wide the irises had almost disappeared. But this one was different, and not one person in that room could have told you exactly why. Maybe it was his age. Maybe it was the fact that his phone, still in his jacket pocket, had been ringing continuously since the ambulance arrived. The same contact, over and over, a name on the screen that no one in the room had been told to call. The compressions continued. 94, 95. Outside the resuscitation room, in a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and old heating pipe rust, a man sat in a plastic chair designed for a much shorter person. His coat was still on. It was a heavy winter coat, the kind you wear for 6-hour drives in February, and it still held the cold of the road. The E22 highway, Yekaterinburg to Perm, 420 kilometers of dark through the Ural foothills. He had driven it in just under 5 hours. He had not eaten. He had not been called by anyone. He simply knew in the particular way that men who have avoided something for too long suddenly know when avoidance has run out of road that he had to come. He had not replied to the text message. That was 19 days ago. He sat in the plastic chair and looked at his hands. Inside the room, the monitor changed. Not to the flat line, not yet, but to something irregular, something jagged and wrong, something that made the attending physician step forward and say a single word to the team. The nurse who'd been counting lost her place for a fraction of a second. She started again. 101. 102. Here is what that number means and why this story exists. By the time the resuscitation attempt at Perm City Hospital number 4 ended on the morning of February 3rd, 2026, the team had counted to 127. Not minutes, not milligrams. 127 individual compressions in a single unbroken sequence, delivered to the chest of a man whose name was Dmitry Volkov, who had been a logistics dispatcher, who had lived with his mother, who had, by every external measure visible to anyone who knew him, been completely ordinary. That number, 127, is what this story is about. Not what it means medically. What it means. On the floor of a Perm apartment, 3 kilometers from that hospital, there was a torn paper packet. Small. Folded the way you fold a piece of paper when you need to carry something dry and powdery without spilling it. A sharp crease down the center, the edges tucked in, the kind of origami you learn not from a book, but from watching someone else do it once and understanding immediately. The powder inside had been white, chalk-coloured, almost pretty, in the way that purely chemical things sometimes are before you understand what they do. The packet was empty now. What was in it? Where it came from? Who made that first fold and handed it across a desk in the middle of a night shift? That is a question with a very specific answer. That answer involves a supervisor named Yegor, a warehouse on the eastern edge of Perm, a police file that was opened in 2024 and closed 3 months later with several names removed, and a word that most people in Russia had heard by 2026 but that Dmitry Volkov, in the beginning, had not. The word is Mephedrone, and the man in the plastic chair outside resuscitation room 3 is still sitting there, coat still on, hands still in his lap, waiting for someone to come through that door and tell him something. No one has come yet. Perm sits at the edge of Europe and Asia the way a city sits at the edge of its own story. Not quite one thing, not quite the other, aware of both and committed to neither. The Kama River cuts through it wide and grey, freezing solid by November, and the factories along its eastern bank have been half running since the Soviet era ended and took the reason for their existence with it. 1 million people live here. Most of them will tell you, if asked, that it's a good city. Most of them will say this while looking slightly to the left of your face. Dmitry Volkov was born here in 2001, the same year the last major textile plant on Komsomolsky Prospect quietly reduced its workforce by 60% and called it restructuring. He grew up in a 9-story concrete apartment block in the Sverdlovsky district. Not the worst neighbourhood in Perm, not the best. The kind of place where the elevator works 3 weeks out of 4 and everyone pretends this is acceptable. His mother Vera taught mathematics at a secondary school 4 bus stops away. His father Gennady left when Dmitry was 9, moving to Yekaterinburg for a job that paid slightly better, and then staying there for reasons that were never fully explained to the boy who remained. Dmitry grew up quiet, not withdrawn, quiet. There's a difference. He had 2 close friends, Ruslan, who he'd known since the 5th grade, and who now worked at a car parts distributor on the south side of the city, and a girl named Polina who had moved to Kazan for university in 2020, and kept in touch mainly through voice messages sent late at night. His social world was small, not because he was unpopular, but because he had calibrated it deliberately, the way certain people do when they grow up in households where emotional resources are rationed. He didn't finish university. He enrolled in a logistics management program at Perm State Technical University in 2019, completed 2 years, then stopped when the tuition increased and Vera's school cut her supplementary hours. He wasn't bitter about this. He simply adjusted and moved forward, which was the thing he did with most obstacles. Not with optimism, but with a flat, functional pragmatism that made him very good at his job and somewhat difficult to know deeply. The job was at a company called Transural LLC, a mid-sized freight logistics firm that operated out of a warehouse complex on Promyshlenaya Street, 12 kilometers from the apartment. Dmitry had started there at 20 as a loading bay assistant, moved to dispatch coordination within 18 months, and by 2024 was running the overnight dispatch desk 3 nights a week. The pay was 31,000 rubles a month for standard hours. With overtime, which he took whenever it was offered, he could reach 44, sometimes 46,000. In Perm in 2024 that was not comfortable, but it was survivable. He worked the night shift because it paid a 12% differential. That's it. That's the whole calculation. Night shifts at Transural ran from 10 in the evening to 6 in the morning. The warehouse never fully slept. Trucks came in from Yekaterinburg, from Kazan, from as far as Tyumen, and someone had to be at the desk to log arrivals, process manifests, coordinate with drivers who had been on the road for 11 hours, and whose patience was roughly equivalent to the temperature outside, which in January was -22. Dmitry managed this with a kind of mechanical calm that his colleagues noticed and occasionally resented. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make promises he couldn't track. He kept a handwritten log of every manifest in addition to the digital system, because the digital system crashed twice a month, and no one had fixed it in 3 years. The warehouse smelled of diesel and frozen cardboard. The break room had a microwave that sparked when you ran it above 4 minutes, and a coffee machine that produced something brown and hot and called it espresso. Dmitry drank 4 cups per shift and felt, by around 3 in the morning, the specific kind of exhaustion that coffee can no longer touch. A heaviness that lives not in the eyelids but somewhere deeper, in the connective tissue, in the jaw. He had been doing this for 2 years. Now comes the part that requires understanding what mephedrone actually is, because without that, nothing that follows makes any sense. Mephedrone is a synthetic stimulant, a laboratory-built chemical that belongs to a family of compounds called cathinones, which are themselves derived from a plant called khat that has been chewed for its stimulating effects in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. But mephedrone is not khat. It is to khat what industrial solvent is to rubbing alcohol, technically related, functionally unrecognizable, and vastly more destructive. It first appeared in European markets around 2007, sold openly online and in head shops under names like Meow Meow, Plant Food, and Bath Salts, labels that were legal fictions, ways of selling a psychoactive drug while technically not selling a drug. It was cheap, it worked fast. And for several years, because it was new, it existed in a legal grey zone that most countries scrambled to close once they understood what they were dealing with. Russia made it a controlled substance in 2010. What happened next is exactly what always happens when a cheap, widely desired substance is banned without any corresponding infrastructure to address why people wanted it in the first place. The supply went underground. The price dropped, counterintuitively, because the production simplified and the distribution networks became more efficient. By 2015, mephedrone was the dominant illegal stimulant in dozens of Russian cities. By 2020, it was everywhere. By 2025, in cities like Perm, Chelyabinsk, Ufa, and Yekaterinburg, it had become so embedded in the informal economy of working-class night-shift labour that some employers, not officially, never officially, had developed a tacit tolerance for its use on site, because workers who used it made fewer errors between 2 and 4 in the morning. This is the world Dmitry Volkov was working inside. He didn't know any of this. He knew his desk, his manifests, his 4 cups of bad coffee, and the particular quality of silence that falls over a warehouse at 3:45 on a Tuesday, when the last truck of the night has been logged and there's nothing left to do but wait for morning. His supervisor on the night shift was a man named Yegor. 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who seems to generate heat from somewhere internal, even in an uninsulated warehouse in February. Yegor had worked at Transural for 9 years. He was liked, genuinely liked. Not in the performative way that people are liked when they have authority, but in the way of someone who shows up consistently and doesn't create problems and occasionally brings homemade food to share at 4 in the morning when morale is low. Dmitry trusted him. That trust had been built over 22 months of shared night shifts, accumulated through small reliable actions. A covered break when Dmitry needed to step outside, a good word to management when a scheduling dispute arose, the particular credibility of someone who has never once given you reason to doubt him. Dmitry had noticed one thing about Yegor that he had never asked about. At 3 in the morning, at the far end of a double shift, when Dmitry felt like his thoughts were arriving through wet concrete, Yegor was still sharp, still present. His eyes clear, his responses quick, his handwriting on the manifests as legible at 5:45 as it had been at 10:15. Dmitry had noticed. He had filed it away. He had never asked. He would not ask for much longer. The night it began was March 14th, 2025, a Thursday. Dmitry had already been awake for 22 hours when his shift started at 10 in the evening. A colleague named Fedot had called in sick that afternoon, genuinely sick, a fever of 39 degrees that his wife had texted Yegor about as proof. and Dmitry had agreed to cover the day coordination desk before coming in for his own overnight shift. He had agreed without hesitation, because the extra hours meant an additional 4,000 rubles, and Vera's heating bill that month had come in higher than expected. By midnight he'd been awake for 26 hours. The warehouse was particularly busy that night. 3 trucks from Tyumen had arrived simultaneously due to a routing delay, all carrying temperature-sensitive freight that needed immediate processing, and the digital dispatch system had chosen that specific moment to freeze on a loading screen that no one had ever seen before, and that the IT contact, reachable only by phone, living in Moscow, 2 hours behind Perm time, was not answering. Dmitry worked through it manually, the way he always did when the system failed, pulling out his handwritten log and cross-referencing manifest by hand, while the Tyumen drivers stood around the desk in their road-smelling jackets, making their impatience visible. He cleared the backlog by 1:45 in the morning. His hands were steady, his thinking was not. By that point the exhaustion had moved past the stage where the body protests, and into the stage where it simply begins operating on a kind of hollow autopilot. Tasks completed, words produced, decisions made, but all of it arriving from somewhere that felt increasingly distant from the person nominally in charge. He had 6 more hours until the shift ended. Yegor appeared at the dispatch desk at approximately 2 in the morning. He didn't make a production of it. That was the detail that mattered. No ceremony, no build-up, nothing that would register as significant in retrospect if you weren't specifically looking for it. He simply set a small folded paper packet on the corner of the desk next to Dmitry's coffee cup, and described it in a few words as something the guys used, something that would get him through the rest of the night. He called it a vitamin supplement. He used the word vitamins specifically. Then he walked back toward the loading bay without waiting for a response, as if the matter were entirely routine, which, and this is the part that requires sitting with, for Yegor it was. Dmitry looked at the packet. It was small, maybe 4 centimeters across when folded. The paper was white, ordinary, the kind torn from a notepad. Inside it, visible through the seam, was a fine white powder the colour and texture of confectioner's sugar. There was no label. There was no list of ingredients. He was 23 years old, awake for 28 hours, trusted the man who had given it to him, and had 6 hours left on a shift that was already dissolving the edges of his concentration. He did not ask what was in it. He unfolded the packet, tapped the powder onto the back of his hand the way he had seen people do in movies, with things that were not vitamins, and inhaled it. It took 11 minutes. That's the number that matters here, not for drama, but for biology. Mephedrone, when absorbed through the nasal membrane, reaches peak blood concentration in 8 to 12 minutes. What Dmitry felt at the 11-minute mark was not a high in any recreational sense of the word. It was not euphoria. It was something more specific and in some ways more insidious than euphoria. It was the sensation of having slept a full 8 hours, of being completely present, of the fog lifting from his thinking so cleanly and completely that the previous hours of grinding exhaustion seemed almost fictional. His vision sharpened. The manifest in front of him came into focus with an almost uncomfortable clarity. His fingers moved faster across the keyboard. The headache that had been building behind his left eye since 11 p.m. simply stopped. He finished the shift without incident. Every manifest processed, every driver logged, every temperature-sensitive load from Tyumen correctly routed and documented. At 6:15 in the morning he walked to the bus stop, rode home and slept for 14 hours. He woke up at 8:30 in the evening feeling normal, slightly hungry, no headache, no unusual anxiety, nothing to flag. He did not ask Yegor what the powder was. Not that day, not the next day. This is not a story about a person who made one catastrophic decision in a moment of weakness. It's a story about how the catastrophic decision was structured to feel like no decision at all. He took something a trusted colleague offered in a professional context. It worked exactly as described, and he moved on. The question of what it actually was never rose high enough in his mind to require answering. That was the architecture of the trap. Not a door slamming shut. A door left slightly open, in a corridor that looked completely familiar. 3 days passed. On the evening of March 17th, Dmitry arrived for his regular overnight shift feeling the ordinary weight of it, the slightly too much coffee, the preliminary awareness of how long the night would be. Yegor was already at the loading bay. Before Dmitry had taken his coat off, before he had logged into the dispatch system, there was another folded packet on the corner of the desk. Yegor had not been asked. He had simply known. Think about that for a moment. The supervisory knowledge embedded in that gesture. Yegor didn't need to be told that it had worked, or that Dmitry would want it again. He had placed the second packet there because in his experience a second packet always followed the first. He had seen this progression enough times to predict it. He had seen where it ended enough times to, and this is the thing, hand over the second packet anyway. Dmitry used it. The shift passed the same way the first one had. Efficiently, clearly, the warehouse problem solvable, and the hours manageable. And this time, at the end, he noticed something new. The packet was not free. Yegor mentioned a price, casually, practically, the way you mention a cost that is obviously fair and requires no negotiation. 300 rubles, less than 4 euros, less than the cost of the bad coffee he drank 4 cups of per shift. Dmitry paid it without thinking. He still didn't know what he had bought. He found out in the most mundane possible way, 3 weeks later, using his phone to look up why he'd had a racing heartbeat for 20 minutes after using the third packet, typing his symptoms into a search engine and arriving at a result that named the compound and described its effects with the clinical neutrality of a medical reference site. He read the entry twice. He sat with his phone on his lap in the break room of the warehouse. Then he put the phone away and went back to the dispatch desk. He knew now. He knew exactly what it was, what it did to a brain over time, what the dependency curve looked like, what the withdrawal felt like, what the cardiovascular risks were. He had read all of it. He had understood all of it. And he had put the phone away and gone back to work because the alternative, stopping, figuring out how to get through the remaining 3 hours of the shift on his own, dealing with whatever came after, required a kind of energy he no longer had access to. That was the moment the door closed. Not when he took the first packet, not when he paid for the second. When he read the page, understood it completely, and chose to put the phone away. That was when the story shifted underneath him, and he had no way of knowing it, because from the inside it still felt like a choice. 4 weeks later, Yegor introduced him to the Telegram channel. It had a name that looked like a random string of characters, the kind of username that means nothing unless you know what you're looking at. The channel had no profile picture. It posted irregularly, sometimes 3 times a day, sometimes not for 5 days at a stretch. The posts were text-only, brief, written in a code that was not particularly sophisticated, but that was just different enough from plain language to keep automated monitoring systems from flagging it immediately. A price, a quantity, a district of the city, named by a number rather than its actual name. A time window, usually 2 hours, during which a small package would be left at a location described in the next message, which arrived only after a payment had been made to a number that changed every 10 days. The whole system took Dmitry about 40 minutes to understand fully. He never bought from Yegor again after that. He had a source now, a direct line, impersonal, reliable, and, critically, without the social texture of obligation that came with buying from your supervisor. He could tell himself, and did, that this represented a kind of autonomy, a practical decision. The price through the channel was lower, the quality consistent, the system frictionless. What he didn't register was that the channel had 1,700 subscribers, in Perm alone. By May 2025, Dmitry had been using Mephedrone for 7 weeks, and the drug had not yet shown him anything it didn't want him to see. That is the specific cruelty of the early phase. Not that it lies, but that it tells a very selective version of the truth. Mephedrone in the first weeks delivers exactly what it promises: sustained alertness, emotional steadiness, the ability to function at full capacity in conditions that would otherwise be impossible. For someone working 3 overnight shifts a week in a warehouse that runs on inadequate staffing and outdated systems, this is not recreational. It is practical. It solves a real problem with real efficiency. And the brain, which is not a moral instrument but a problem-solving one, files it under solutions rather than threats. What the brain doesn't file, because it has no mechanism to, is what is happening underneath the solution. Mephedrone forces the brain to release dopamine and serotonin in quantities that the organ was not designed to produce on demand. These are not exotic chemicals. They are the brain's own language, the molecules it uses to signal reward, satisfaction, connection, and rest. The drug essentially reaches into the brain's chemistry cabinet and throws everything onto the floor at once, producing an intensity of feel-good signaling that normal life, normal sleep, normal achievement, normal human connection simply cannot replicate. The brain experiences this, adapts to it, and begins recalibrating its baseline. After enough exposure, it stops producing these chemicals at normal levels on its own, because why would it? The supply is coming from outside. The internal factory slows, then it nearly stops. This process takes weeks in some people, in others, months. The timeline varies by individual brain chemistry, by dose, by frequency, by a dozen other variables that no one fully understands yet. What is consistent is the direction, always the same direction. Dmitry didn't feel the recalibration happening. He felt its opposite: stability, competence, the satisfying sense of being equal to his circumstances. He used on shift nights, 3 times a week, consistent, controlled. He told himself this was manageable because it was structured, and structured things felt safe. He kept his handwritten log. He processed his manifests. He drank his bad coffee and rode the night bus home and slept and woke up and went to the store and visited his mother on Sunday afternoons and ate the food she made and answered her questions about work and watched whatever was on the television without really watching it. Life from the outside looked unchanged. From inside his skull, something very quiet was shifting. On the other side of Perm, not metaphorically, literally on the other side of the city, in the northern district of Perm near the Kama River embankment, Alina Sorokina was beginning her 4th consecutive week of 12-hour shifts at City Hospital No. 4. She was 31 years old. She had been a nurse for 8 years, the last 4 in the psychiatric and toxicology intake ward, which in the medical hierarchy of Russian regional hospitals is the department that receives everything the other departments cannot immediately categorize. The patients who arrive frightened of things that are not there, the ones who haven't slept in 4 days and whose bodies are shaking from the inside out, the ones who are brought in by strangers, neighbours, passers-by, people who found them, because there was no one else to call. Alina had seen Mephedrone patients before 2025. She had seen the first wave in Perm around 2018, when the drug was still relatively new to the city, and the cases presented with a kind of rawness. People who had used heavily and recently, and whose symptoms were acute and legible. Psychosis, cardiac arrhythmia, extreme agitation. The cases were difficult but diagnosable. What she was seeing in the spring of 2025 was different in texture, and the difference bothered her in a way she couldn't fully articulate to her colleagues. The patients were younger. More of them were employed, not transient, not homeless, not the profile that the institutional literature described as high risk. They were warehouse workers, delivery drivers, factory shift supervisors, call centre staff. People who worked nights and needed to function, and had found a solution and then arrived in her ward when the solution had outrun their bodies. They came in with cardiac rhythms that looked like static on the monitor. They came in convinced that specific people were following them. They came in having not slept in 70, 80, 90 hours, their nervous systems running on a stimulant that the body could no longer metabolize fast enough to bring back down. In April 2025, Alina treated 7 such patients. In May, 11. She kept her own informal count in a notebook she carried in her left scrub pocket, a small green notebook with a rubber band around it, the kind sold at every stationery kiosk in Russia for 30 rubles. Date, age, presenting symptoms, likely substance, outcome. She'd started the notebook in January. By the end of May, it had 43 entries. 31 of them were Mephedrone. One of those entries, dated May 7th, described a 19-year-old male brought in by his roommate after spending 6 hours attempting to barricade the windows of their shared apartment against an intrusion he was absolutely certain was imminent. He was calm when he arrived, not the shaking, wild-eyed calm of someone fighting their own terror, but the eerie, methodical calm of someone whose internal reality had become entirely self-consistent. He explained the situation with complete coherence. The logic was intact, only the premises were wrong. Mephedrone psychosis does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with impeccable reasoning and false foundations, and the person inside it has no way of knowing which parts of their perception they can still trust. He was stabilized over 48 hours, discharged on day 5. Alina wrote his entry in the green notebook and went to see the next patient. Meanwhile, in May, Dmitry used for the first time outside of a work context. It was a Saturday, his day off. He had slept well the previous night, genuinely well without the drug, but woke to a specific flatness that he hadn't experienced before in quite that form. Not sadness, not anxiety. A grey quality to everything, as if the apartment's lighting had been slightly reduced, and the reduction was coming from inside him, rather than from the bulbs. He ate breakfast. The food tasted correctly but registered as nothing. He sat at his computer. The things that usually held his attention didn't. He told himself it was tiredness. He told himself it was the weather, which was overcast. He told himself a version of this for approximately 4 hours before he retrieved the packet from the bottom of his sock drawer, where he kept the supply he'd ordered through the channel. Within 12 minutes the flatness was gone. He spent the afternoon reorganizing his desk, replying to messages from Ruslan he'd let accumulate for a week, and feeling, this is the specific word, fine. Just fine. The completely ordinary sensation of being okay, which should require no chemical assistance and which his brain was now unable to produce independently. He didn't register what had happened. The shift from work tool to emotional baseline had occurred so incrementally, across so many ordinary days, that it had no visible edge. There was no moment he could point to. There was only the fact that Saturday without it now felt like a problem, and Saturday with it felt like Saturday was supposed to feel. That distinction between correcting a deficit and creating a need is the hinge on which everything else in this story turns. The Telegram channel he'd been ordering from was one node in a network that, by mid-2025, stretched across 14 Russian cities. The operation was not a street-level dealing outfit. It was a structured, tiered distribution system operating through encrypted messaging apps, using a payment method called cryptocurrency that left no conventional banking trail, and employing a delivery model borrowed directly from legitimate courier services, small packages, nondescript packaging, dropped at prearranged locations called caches or dead drops, which customers collected without ever meeting a human being involved in the supply chain. The elegance of the system was functional, not aesthetic. By removing human contact from the transaction entirely, it eliminated the most vulnerable point in traditional drug distribution, the moment when buyer and seller occupy the same physical space. A police operation targeting street dealers required surveillance, pursuit, physical interception. Targeting this network required something the Perm Regional Drug Enforcement Unit simply did not have: a dedicated cybercrime team with cryptocurrency tracing capability and the legal framework to act on what they found. That unit had been requested in 2022. The budget allocation had been approved in 2023. The unit had not yet been assembled by the summer of 2025. Russia had dissolved its dedicated Federal Drug Control Agency, the FSKN, in 2016, folding its functions into the Interior Ministry in a restructuring that was described officially as an efficiency measure. What it meant in practice was that drug enforcement in regional cities like Perm became the responsibility of generalist police departments that were simultaneously managing everything else: traffic, property crime, public order, the administrative demands of a country whose bureaucratic load on its regional forces had been increasing steadily for years. The channel with 1,700 Perm subscribers operated in this gap. Not invisibly, the authorities knew it existed in general terms, but untouchably, because touching it required resources that hadn't arrived and authorities that hadn't been assembled. Dmitry ordered twice a week through June, 3 times a week by July. The orders were small, a gram at a time, sometimes less, but the frequency was the variable that mattered. Each order meant a new packet, a new decision that was no longer really a decision, a new day that began with the awareness of the supply in the sock drawer and what it would feel like to use it. He started using before shifts now, not just during. A small amount, an hour before leaving the apartment, to arrive at the warehouse already clear rather than waiting for the fog to lift on its own. He told himself this was efficiency. He had a very organized relationship with his own rationalizations. His weight in July was 67 kilograms. He had weighed 71 in March. The 4 kilograms were not visible yet in his face or his clothes, but his colleague Ruslan, who had known him since they were 11 years old, and who had the particular attentiveness of someone who grew up watching a friend carefully without ever being told why, noticed that Dmitry had stopped eating the sandwich he always brought to eat at the end of his shift. Not reduced it. Stopped. The sandwich still appeared in his bag every night. It came home untouched every morning. Ruslan noticed. He didn't say anything. He filed it. And somewhere in the logs of the Perm Interior Ministry's Organised Crime Unit, in a document that had been generated in March 2024 and that was no longer actively referenced by anyone, there was a name attached to a warehouse on Promyshlenaya Street and a note about suspected on-site distribution of synthetic stimulants to employees. The document existed. It was real. It named the location and described the pattern with reasonable accuracy. What it did not contain, in its current form, the form it had taken after 3 months of investigation and 1 meeting with a senior official whose name appeared nowhere in the final report, was the name of the supervisor responsible. That name had been in the original draft. It wasn't there anymore. October arrived in Perm the way it always does, without warning, as if the city had simply forgotten that autumn was coming and then found winter already standing at the door. The Kama froze along its edges first, thin ice forming overnight and crackling under the weight of nothing, and the warehouse on Promyshlenaya Street became the kind of cold that a space heater in the corner cannot meaningfully address. Dmitry had been using for 7 months. The number on the bathroom scale that morning read 59 kilograms. He had started the year at 71. He registered the number the way you register a fact about someone else, correctly, without attachment. He was not trying to lose weight. He was not aware in any felt sense that he was losing it. His appetite had simply become a theoretical concept, something he understood intellectually but that no longer produced any sensation in his body that required action. He was still working, still precise, still keeping the handwritten log alongside the digital system that crashed twice a month. From the outside, the machinery of his professional life was intact, and that intactness was itself a kind of camouflage, because the things that were going wrong were happening in spaces that his job did not illuminate, inside the apartment, inside the hours between shifts, inside the specific quality of a Tuesday afternoon when there was nothing required of him, and the absence of requirement had become, over months, genuinely unbearable. Ruslan met him for coffee in the first week of October. It was the first time they'd seen each other in 6 weeks, which was unusual. They had historically met at least twice a month, a habit built over more than a decade of friendship. The gap had happened through a series of reschedulings that each made individual sense, but that, taken together, formed a pattern Ruslan had been quietly tracking. He studied Dmitry across the table of the cafe on Lenina Street where they always met and said nothing for the first few minutes, long enough to be sure of what he was seeing. Dmitry's face was thinner. His jawline, which had always been slightly rounded, now had a sharpness to it that changed his appearance in a way that was difficult to attribute to any single feature. His eyes were bright, too bright, the artificial brightness of a person running on stimulants rather than sleep. And his hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, were not shaking yet, but had a quality of over-stillness, as if he were actively preventing them from doing something. Ruslan asked if everything was okay. Dmitry said he'd been running, that he'd lost some weight from running and that he felt fine, better than fine, and then he immediately redirected the conversation to Ruslan's job, his girlfriend, anything else, with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd been rehearsing this particular deflection. Ruslan let it go, but before they parted he looked at Dmitry one more time, the specific look of someone committing a version of a person to memory, in case they need to compare it to something later. 11 days after that coffee, on an overnight shift in mid-October, Dmitry's heart did something it had never done before. He was alone in the dispatch booth at 2:17 in the morning. The warehouse was quiet, one truck still in the loading bay, its driver asleep in the cab, its freight already logged. Dmitry was updating the handwritten log when his heart rate accelerated to a speed that was immediately physically perceptible. Not the mild quickening of caffeine or adrenaline, but a pounding so forceful and rapid that he could feel it in his throat, in his temples, behind his eyes. Simultaneously, his peripheral vision contracted, the edges of his visual field darkening and narrowing as his body redirected blood flow in response to a cardiac signal it didn't understand. He was completely certain, for 8 minutes, that he was dying. Not afraid of dying, certain. The distinction matters. There was no panic, because panic requires uncertainty, and this felt like information. His body was informing him of a conclusion. He sat very still at the dispatch desk, his hands flat on the surface, and breathed in the particular controlled way that people breathe when they're trying to negotiate with their own physiology. 8 minutes. Then it passed. His heart returned to its normal rhythm with a stuttering deceleration that felt almost mechanical, like a machine downshifting. The vision cleared from the edges inward. The pounding in his throat subsided. He sat for another 2 minutes without moving, then picked up his pen and finished the line in the handwritten log that he had stopped writing mid-entry. He told no one. This is not a remarkable detail. It is the detail. Because what a doctor, informed of those 8 minutes, would have told him is this: what he experienced was almost certainly a cardiac arrhythmia, an electrical misfiring in the heart's rhythm caused by the sustained toxic load that mephedrone places on the cardiovascular system over months of use. Mephedrone does not only affect the brain, it constricts blood vessels, forces the heart to work at elevated rates for extended periods, and gradually disrupts the electrical signals that keep cardiac rhythm stable. It is, in a purely mechanical sense, a slow assault on the organ that keeps every other organ alive. Dmitry knew this. He had read the medical reference page in April. He had put the phone away. He put this away too. Filed it as a single event, an anomaly, something that had happened once and would not happen again because it hadn't happened before. 2 weeks passed without another episode. The filing felt confirmed. On the last Thursday of October, Dmitry developed a persistent headache that sat behind his left eye and did not respond to the painkiller tablets he bought at the pharmacy on his way home from a shift. After 4 days of it, he went to a walk-in clinic near his apartment, not because the headache was unbearable, but because it had a quality of wrongness that he couldn't metabolize through his usual methods of simply waiting for things to correct themselves. The clinic was a standard regional facility, beige walls, a waiting room that smelled of the particular cleaning product used in every institutional space in Russia, a numbered ticket system that had been broken for 3 weeks, and that staff navigated by calling names from a handwritten list. He waited 40 minutes. A nurse came to take his vitals before the doctor saw him. Her name was Alina Sorokina. She did not know this was significant. He was patient number 11 of her current shift. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, noted the reading. 141/92 elevated for someone his age, and clipped a pulse oximeter to his finger. His heart rate was 98 beats per minute at rest, which is technically within the upper range of normal, but which, for a 23-year-old sitting still in a waiting room, was fast. She noted it. She looked at him. The thinness, the overbright eyes, the particular quality of stillness, and added a flag to his intake form. The word she used in her note was anxious, because she had learned to use precise words that described observable behaviours rather than suspected causes, because in a regional clinic the word suspected substance use on an intake form created paperwork pathways that took an average of 6 additional minutes per patient, and she had 14 people still waiting. The doctor ordered a standard blood panel and a toxicology screen. Here is what the standard toxicology screen at that clinic tested for: opiates, cannabis metabolites, amphetamine, cocaine, and benzodiazepines. These were the 5 categories on the panel, a panel designed in the early 2000s, when those were the primary substances of concern in the region. Mephedrone is a synthetic cathinone. It is not amphetamine, though it produces similar effects. It does not appear on an amphetamine test. It requires a specific targeted cathinone panel to detect, a panel that costs more, takes longer to process, and was not part of the standard order set at that clinic, or at most regional facilities in Perm in 2025. The results came back clean. The doctor reviewed them, prescribed a course of ibuprofen for the headache, suggested Dmitry reduce his caffeine intake, and discharged him. The interaction lasted 6 minutes. The headache resolved on its own 3 days later. Alina's note: patient appears anxious, consider follow-up, was appended to his file and remained there, unscheduled, because follow-up at a walk-in clinic without an established patient relationship required the patient to self-initiate, and nothing in the system prompted Dmitry to return, and nothing in the system prompted the clinic to reach out. She went home that evening and did not think about the quiet young man with the fast heartbeat. This was not negligence. It was arithmetic. 14 more patients, then a bus, then dinner, then sleep. then back. The green notebook in her left scrub pocket had 43 entries. She had no reason to open it for this one, but she had seen him. That fact would not stay inert. November came. Dmitry's usage crossed into territory that even his own internal accounting system could no longer classify as controlled. The shift from 3 times a week to daily had happened across October, not in a single decision, but through a sequence of days where the alternative had seemed incrementally less viable than the day before. By the first week of November, he was using every morning before any other activity, a small dose, the amount calibrated to bring him to baseline before he could determine what baseline felt like without it. He was spending 18,000 rubles a month on the drug. This was more than a third of his salary. He had stopped saving. He had stopped having the thing he'd been saving for. The memory of its specific content had blurred sometime over the summer, like a photograph left in sunlight. He was still logging every manifest. He was still on time. He was still, from the desk of the overnight dispatch booth, entirely functional. At home, the locked door. Vera noticed the locked door first in November. Dmitry's bedroom door had never had a lock on it when he was growing up. The apartment was too small for that kind of privacy, and privacy had been managed through the informal understanding that you knocked. The lock was new, a simple sliding bolt he'd installed himself, and Vera discovered it one Sunday afternoon when she knocked without answer and tried the handle and found it wouldn't move. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and finished making the food she'd been preparing, because there was nothing in her understanding of her son, the quiet, pragmatic, reliable person she had raised, that gave her the right framework to place the locked door inside a larger picture she did not yet have access to. She left a plate outside the door. When she checked an hour later, the plate was gone. The door was still locked. That Sunday, Ruslan called Dmitry Volkov in Yekaterinburg. He had been considering it for 3 weeks, turning it over, testing it against the possibility that he was wrong, that the sandwich that came home untouched every morning and the jawline in the rescheduled meetings were all individually explicable and collectively added up to nothing. But the locked door, which Vera mentioned to him when he called to check in on her, describing it with the careful neutrality of a woman choosing her words, was the thing that moved him from considering to dialing. Gennady answered on the 3rd ring. Ruslan told him what he'd seen: the weight loss, the rescheduling, the brightness in Dmitry's eyes that wasn't the brightness of someone who was well. He didn't name a substance, he didn't know the substance, but he described the shape of it clearly enough that Gennady understood what kind of conversation this was. Gennady said he would think about it. That was what he said. He would think about it. The call ended. Gennady sat with his phone in his hand in his apartment in Yekaterinburg, 420 kilometers east, and thought about a 9-year-old boy who had never asked him why he left, and who had, as far as Gennady knew, never stopped not asking. The phone stayed in his hand. He did not call back. November 2025 in Perm was the coldest in 11 years. The temperature dropped to -28 on the 3rd week of the month and stayed there, and the city contracted around it the way cities in the Urals have always contracted against extreme cold. Inward, quieter, people moving faster between buildings with their chins tucked into their collars, and the particular perm walk that locals develop unconsciously, a slight forward lean that cuts through wind rather than facing it. The warehouse on Promyshlenaya Street was burning through heating costs at a rate that the facilities manager was documenting for a budget complaint that would be filed in January and ignored in February. Dmitry lost 3 more kilograms in November. His face now showed it. The hollowing under his cheekbones, the way his collar sat too wide at the neck. Small details, each individually deniable, together forming a picture that anyone who had known him before March would read immediately. He wore the same clothes as before. They fit differently. He did not buy new ones. The dosage had climbed in a way that the word gradual no longer adequately described. He was using 2 grams a week by mid-November, a quantity that 4 months earlier would have lasted him 3 weeks. The brain's recalibration had continued its silent work. The same dose that once produced clarity now produced only the absence of withdrawal, which is a categorically different thing. He was no longer getting high, he was getting level. The drug had stopped being an elevator and become a floor, the minimum surface required to stand on before the day could begin. 2 grams a week cost him 22,000 rubles. His monthly salary with overtime was 44,000. The math had a very short runway. Across the city, Alina Sorokina was in her department head's office for the second time in 6 weeks. She had brought the green notebook. She laid it on his desk without asking permission, opened it to the page where she had begun tallying Mephedrone presentations by week, and pointed to the column on the right side where the numbers ran. 4 in the first week of September, 6 in the second, 9 by the end of October, 11 in the first 2 weeks of November, and the month wasn't finished. Her department head was a man named Dr. Chesnokov, 53 years old, who had run the department for 14 years and who had the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a decade and a half fighting institutional inertia and has achieved a working relationship with it rather than a victory over it. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the column. He said the words that Alina had already predicted he would say, that the data was compelling, that it needed to go to administration, that he would raise it at the next departmental meeting, which was scheduled for December 9th. She left the notebook on his desk when she left. He called after her that she'd forgotten it. She told him to keep it. The memo she wrote that evening, at home, at her kitchen table, in the same practical language she used in patient notes, described a pattern of synthetic cathinone toxicity presenting in employed males aged 19 to 34 across multiple Perm districts, concentrating in night shift industrial workers and escalating in frequency across a 9-month observation period. She cited the 11 cathinone-specific cases in November alone. She noted that the standard tox panel did not detect the substance. She recommended updating the panel. She sent it to Dr. Chesnokov by internal hospital email at 11:47 p.m. She received an automatic read receipt at 11:48. A human response arrived December 4th, acknowledging the memo and confirming it would be discussed at the December 9th meeting. The December 9th meeting was cancelled due to a staffing emergency in the surgical ward and rescheduled for January. Meanwhile, 3 specific things happened in the last 10 days of November that, taken separately, were each explicable. Together they formed the shape of an acceleration that had passed some invisible threshold. The first, Dmitry missed a shift. Not a late arrival, not a partial shift. A complete no-show, no call, no message to Yegor or anyone else at the warehouse. He had been awake for 56 hours prior to that shift, a duration made possible by the amount he'd been using, and when the shift was due to start he was in his bedroom with the bolt drawn and his phone face down on the floor and no accessible version of himself that could perform the task of getting up, getting dressed, and going outside. The warehouse managed without him. Yegor covered the desk himself and sent a single message the following morning, asking if everything was all right. Dmitry replied 6 hours later that he'd been ill. The second, Vera found the packets. Not the supply itself. Dmitry had moved it from the sock drawer to a location more deliberately concealed, but 3 used packets, empty, the folded white paper with the crease down the centre, tucked behind the pipe under the bathroom sink. She found them while retrieving a dropped earring. She held them in her palm, unfolded one, recognized nothing. She had never seen this specific configuration before. The folded paper, the white residue, the absence of any label. She put them in her pocket and said nothing to Dmitry. That evening she typed a description of what she'd found into a search engine. The results took 11 seconds to return. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading them. She did not confront Dmitry. She did not call a doctor or a helpline or the police. She made his dinner, the same dinner she made every week, buckwheat with chicken, the smell of it filling the apartment the way it always had, and put it outside his locked door and went to bed, and the sound of her lying awake in the next room was not a sound Dmitry could hear, but was happening nonetheless, on the other side of a wall, in the dark. The third thing, in the last week of November, a 26-year-old man named Pavel Grishin died in his apartment in the Ordzhonikidze district of Perm. He had been a delivery driver. He had lived alone. His neighbours reported not seeing him for 3 days before the building manager was called. The official cause of death listed on the document released to his family was acute cardiac failure. The toxicology results, which took 11 days to return and which required a specific Cathanon panel ordered by the forensic pathologist on instinct, showed a Mephedrone concentration in his blood that would have required sustained heavy use over months. Pavel Grishin was not in Alina's green notebook. He had never presented at City Hospital No. 4 or any other Perm medical facility in the months before his death. He had managed his symptoms, whatever they were, entirely privately, until there were no more symptoms to manage. The local news item about his death was 4 sentences long. It didn't mention Mephedrone. It ran on the Perm regional news site on December 2nd and received 63 views. Now comes the thing the viewer of this story knows that almost no one inside it does. In the Interior Ministry's Organised Crime Division in Perm, there was a folder, a physical folder, manila, the kind with the string closure that wraps around a circular tab, containing the documents from the 2024 investigation into Transural LLC on Promyshlenaya Street. The investigation had been opened in March 2024 following an anonymous tip submitted through the ministry's online reporting portal. The tip described on-site distribution of synthetic stimulants to warehouse employees during night shifts, named the location specifically, and described a pattern of supply that had been ongoing for at least 8 months prior to the report. The original case file, assembled over 3 months by an investigator named Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov, contained 3 key documents: a surveillance log, a financial analysis of anomalous cash transactions connected to the company's informal payment records, and a list of individuals identified as potentially involved in distribution. That list, in its original form, contained 7 names. The file was reviewed by a senior official in September 2024. The meeting took place. The minutes record its occurrence, but the minutes do not record what was discussed. The file was closed in October 2024. 3 months of investigative work, closed without charges, without referral, without public record of a reason. The version of the document that remained in the folder after closure contained a list of 4 names. 3 had been removed. One of those 3 was Yegor. Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov requested a review of the closure decision in November 2024. His request was acknowledged. He was reassigned to traffic enforcement in December 2024. He was still working traffic enforcement in November 2025, when Dmitry Volkov was losing his 3rd kilogram of the month, and Vera was lying awake in the dark, and a man named Pavel Grishin was already past the point where any of it could help him. December arrived. Dmitry's double shifts resumed. He needed the money, urgently, with a specificity that had replaced the vague saving for something of his earlier financial life. The extra shifts meant extra hours, which meant more of the drug to cover the hours, which meant more cost, which meant more shifts. He recognized the geometry of this. He had always been good at logistics. He started selling small amounts to 2 other people at the warehouse, not through the channel, directly, at a markup that helped close the gap. He sourced more than he used, ordered in larger quantities through the channel, divided it himself using the folded paper method he had learned from watching Yegor do it once, more than a year ago, in what felt now like a different person's life. Ruslan called in the second week of December and asked directly, not diplomatically, not carefully, but directly, with the bluntness of someone who has decided that carefulness has used up its turn. He asked what was happening, what Dmitry was taking, and whether he needed help. Dmitry told him he didn't know what he was talking about. He said this calmly, without anger, with the same flat pragmatism he brought to every problem. He ended the call without raising his voice. Ruslan called Gennady again that night. This time he didn't describe symptoms. He said one sentence, that he thought Dmitry was in serious trouble and that someone needed to go to Perm. Gennady said he would think about it. On January 14th, 2026, Dmitry opened a new message on his phone and typed 4 words to a contact he hadn't initiated a conversation with in 14 months. The message read, "Dad, can we meet sometime?" He sent it, put the phone face down on the desk and did not look at it again for the rest of the night. The message sat unread for 6 hours. Then it was read. The 2 blue check marks appeared in the corner of the message, the universal signal that the recipient had opened it. That was all. No reply. Just the blue check marks confirming that the words had arrived at their destination. Dmitry looked at the check marks. Then he put the phone face down again. He waited 3 days, a week, 10 days, 14 days. 19 days passed from the moment those check marks appeared, and no reply came, and the fact of the unanswered text message added a specific weight to the other specific weights already accumulated. And on the evening of February 1st, something happened that would determine everything that came next. What happened on February 1st is not a small thing. But it does not come yet. There is a document. It exists in physical form in a manila folder, in a filing cabinet in the Perm Interior Ministry building on Sibirskaya Street, and it also exists as a digital file on a server that backs up every 72 hours to a secondary location in Kazan. It has a case number. It has a date range, March 2024 to October 2024. It has a stamp on the cover page that reads, in standard administrative Russian, closed, no further action. What it does not have is an explanation for why. Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov had spent 11 weeks building the case inside that folder. He was 34 years old, had been with the organised crime unit for 6 years, and had the particular professional quality of someone who is genuinely good at a job that doesn't reward being genuinely good at it. His surveillance log of Transural LLC on Promyshlenaya Street ran to 47 pages. He had documented 11 separate instances of what he described as probable on-site distribution, specific times, specific locations within the warehouse complex, specific individuals observed in proximity to transactions. He had cross-referenced cash withdrawals from accounts connected to warehouse management with the timing of bulk purchases from a supplier chain that traced, through 2 shell entities, to a synthetic chemical manufacturer in Chelyabinsk. The original list had 7 names on it. Ovchinnikov had assembled that list methodically over weeks, using sources he'd cultivated carefully and methods that were procedurally sound. The 7th name on the list, added last after the most careful verification, because it was the name that required the most care, was a 41-year-old warehouse supervisor with 9 years at the company and no prior record. That name was Yegor. The September meeting with the senior official, whose name appears in the meeting minutes only as Division Chief K, lasted 22 minutes according to the log. Ovchinnikov was not present. The file was reviewed without him. When the folder came back to his desk in October, sealed and stamped closed, he opened it and counted the names on the list. 4. He sat with that number for 3 days before filing the review request that was acknowledged and acted on by transferring him to traffic enforcement, where he spent his days issuing fines for expired registrations on the E22 highway, including, on one occasion in January 2025, a truck departing from Transural LLC on Promyshlenaya Street, whose cargo manifest had an irregularity he was no longer in a position to investigate. He noted the truck's license plate in his personal notebook. Then he issued the fine and waved the driver on. This is the architecture that Dmitry Volkov was living inside without knowing it existed. The supply chain that fed the Telegram channel with 1,700 subscribers, the channel that fed his sock drawer, the drawer that fed the folded packets. It ran upward through layers that had been examined once and protected once and then sealed away, and the person who had done the examining was now spending his professional hours on a highway, and the person who had needed examining was still inside the warehouse, still supervising night shifts, still generating heat from somewhere internal even in February. Now the frame resets. Everything the viewer has understood about this story up to this moment has been true. The facts are correct. The sequence is accurate. But there is one fact that reframes every other fact, and it is this: the number 127. It is not a case file number. It is not a street address. It is not a chapter in a report or a clause in a law or a reference code in an administrative document. It is not any of the things that a number attached to a story about bureaucratic failure and institutional neglect might logically be expected to be. It is the number of compressions. On the morning of February 3rd, 2026, in Resuscitation Room 3 of Perm City Hospital No. 4, a team of 4 medical staff worked on Dmitry Volkov's stopped heart for 11 minutes and 4 seconds without pause. The protocol for cardiac resuscitation requires compressions at a rate of 100 per minute, firm, rhythmic, deep enough to physically move the blood through a heart that is no longer moving it independently. At that rate, over 11 minutes, the count reaches approximately 110. The team exceeded that. They exceeded it because the attending physician did not call the attempt until the monitor showed them something worth stopping for, and the monitor showed them that something at 127. The nurse who counted was Alina Sorokina. She counted because in her ward, in her practice, in the personal protocol she had developed across 8 years of working with patients whose bodies were failing from substances rather than from age, counting was how she stayed present. It was how she kept the work from becoming abstract. 1, 2, 3. A human being, one compression at a time, pulled back toward the surface. She had not yet connected the patient on the gurney to the entry in her intake file from October. The quiet young man with the elevated heart rate and the 2 bright eyes, discharged with ibuprofen and a recommendation to reduce caffeine. She would make that connection later, in a different kind of silence. But in that room, counting, she had no information except the one in front of her. A 24-year-old male in full cardiac arrest, presenting with a toxicology screen. This time, finally, the right toxicology screen, ordered by the paramedic who had recognized the presentation pattern from 2 previous calls that week, showing Mephedrone at a concentration that the attending physician later described in his notes as among the highest he had personally encountered. The hospital's standard tox panel had been updated in December 2025 to include synthetic cathinones. The update had been recommended in Alina's November memo. It had been discussed at the January departmental meeting, the one rescheduled from December. It had been approved and implemented on December 29th, 6 days before the meeting where it was discussed, because Dr. Chesnokov, whatever his limitations as an administrator, had read Alina's memo twice and submitted the panel update request to the lab unilaterally, without waiting for the committee to catch up. One decision, made quietly, by a tired man at a desk had changed what the paramedics could detect when they arrived at Dmitry's apartment on February 3rd. That detection changed what the resuscitation team knew before they began. That knowledge changed what they looked for during the 11 minutes. What they found at compression 127 was a cardiac rhythm, irregular, fragile, the electrical equivalent of a signal coming through heavy interference, but present, undeniably present. The monitor showed it, and the attending physician leaned forward and the room shifted in the specific way that rooms shift when the balance tips from one outcome toward another. But here is what none of the 4 people in that room knew while this was happening. In the hallway outside, not yet arrived, not yet sitting in the plastic chair, still turning off the E22 highway into the streets of Perm with 420 kilometers of February dark behind him, was a man who had left Yekaterinburg at midnight without telling anyone, without being called by anyone, driving toward a city he had left 15 years ago, for reasons he had never explained to the person most affected by them. Dmitry Volkov had read the text message 19 days ago. He had looked at the 4 words, "Dad, can we meet sometime?" And he had not replied, not because he didn't want to, but because the wanting had a specific weight attached to it that he had spent 15 years learning to carry without moving under it. And the message had asked him to move, and he had sat with that for 19 days, until sitting with it had become indistinguishable from not being able to breathe. He had left at midnight, not in response to a call. There was no call. He had simply reached the end of the 19 days at approximately 11:45 p.m. on February 2nd, picked up his coat and his keys, and walked to his car in the Yekaterinburg cold. He didn't know when he left what had already happened in a Perm apartment at 2:40 in the morning. A neighbour on the floor below Dmitry's apartment, a woman named Raisa, 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher who slept lightly and who had lived in the building for 31 years, had heard a sound at 2:42 a.m. Not a cry, not a crash, a sound the body makes when it stops holding itself upright, a single, muffled impact, the kind that belongs to no category of normal nighttime noise. She had lain still for a moment, listening. Nothing followed. She got up, put on her robe, and called emergency services from her landline because her mobile phone was charging in the kitchen and she was already in the hallway. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. The door to Dmitry's apartment was locked. The paramedics used the master key obtained from the building manager, who'd been sleeping and who arrived in the corridor with his coat over his pajamas, still carrying the key ring. Inside the apartment, the lights were on. All of them. Every room, which is a detail that the lead paramedic noted in his report as consistent with the agitated, hypervigilant state that precedes stimulant-induced cardiac events. The kitchen table held an empty glass, a phone face down, and 3 folded paper packets, 2 empty, 1 not. Dmitry was on the floor of the hallway between the bedroom and the bathroom, on his back, his eyes partially open, his colour the specific grey that the human face becomes when the heart has stopped, and the blood beneath the skin is no longer being moved. The paramedics had been trained. They worked fast. The phone on the kitchen table had been ringing intermittently since before the ambulance arrived. The contact name on the screen, visible through the face-down phone's notification on the edge, was Mama. Vera had called 4 times from the other side of the city, in the specific hours of the night when a mother who has not been sleeping calls because she stopped pretending that she is. She had not known. She had felt it. The paramedic who ordered the cathinone panel did so in the ambulance, before they reached the hospital, based on the 3 folded packets and the phone screen's missed calls, and the 11 months of call-outs he had attended across Perm that had trained him to recognise the specific combination of physical presentation and domestic evidence that pointed to one substance above all others in early 2026. The hospital was 4 minutes away, and on the A22 highway, moving through February dark at 110 kilometers per hour, Dmitry Volkov did not yet know that 9 minutes would determine everything, that 4 minutes would determine the rest, and that the plastic chair outside resuscitation room 3 was already waiting for him as if it had always been there. He drove. The road was empty. The Ural foothills were black shapes against a black sky, distinguishable only by the absence of stars where they rose. He had the heater on full and his coat still buttoned because he had not thought to take it off before getting in the car, and the 4 words his son had sent him 19 days ago were not playing in his mind the way thoughts play. They were simply present, the way a weight is present, the way a fact is present when you have run out of ways to put it somewhere else. "Dad, can we meet sometime?" He had not replied. He drove faster. The resuscitation team stepped back at 6:41 in the morning, not because they had given up, because the monitor was showing them something that required a different kind of attention than compressions. The irregular, interference-heavy rhythm that had appeared at compression 127 had not resolved into a normal heartbeat, but it had not disappeared either. It flickered on the screen with the specific quality of something fighting to stabilize, a signal trying to find its frequency, and the attending physician, a man named Dr. Barinov, 47 years old, who had been on shift since 10 the previous evening, and whose coffee had gone cold on the counter outside the room 3 hours ago, stood at the foot of the gurney and watched it with the focused stillness of someone reading a language they know, but that is being spoken very quietly. The rhythm held, fragile, wrong in its shape, the peaks and valleys of the waveform too irregular to be called stable by any clinical definition, but present, continuous. The line on the monitor was not flat. Dmitry was alive. The word alive requires immediate qualification, because alive at that moment meant something very specific and not especially reassuring. His heart was beating, but its electrical system had been disrupted at a level that would require monitoring for days before any prognosis could be attached to the word survival with confidence. His brain had been without adequate oxygen for a period that began before the paramedics arrived, the exact duration unknown, because Raisa downstairs had heard a sound, not a collapse, and the gap between the sound and the call and the arrival was a window of uncertain width. Cardiac arrest combined with sustained stimulant toxicity, combined with unknown hypoxic duration, combined with a body that had been running at 58 kilograms for 2 months. Each of these was a variable. Together they formed a clinical picture that Dr. Barinov documented with a precision that was, in its thoroughness, its own kind of grim. He was moved to the ECU at 7:12 in the morning. At 7:19, Dmitry Volkov walked through the main entrance of Perm City Hospital number 4. He had parked the car badly, half on the curb, the kind of parking that happens when the body's moving faster than the mind, and walked through the entrance doors, still buttoning his coat against a cold he was no longer outside in. The reception desk directed him to the ICU waiting area on the 3rd floor. He took the stairs. He arrived at the corridor and found a plastic chair and sat in it, and did not take his coat off, because taking the coat off would have required a deliberate act of settling, and settling was not something his body was prepared to perform. He had driven 420 kilometers. He had not been called. Nobody at this hospital knew his name or his relationship to the person in the ICU, or that he existed at all in connection to the situation. He was a man in a heavy winter coat in a hospital corridor, and everything he knew about what had happened he had learned from the receptionist downstairs, who had said, with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers hard information many times a day, that his son had been admitted following a cardiac event, and that a doctor would come to speak with family members as soon as one was available. Family members. Gennady had not been a functional family member for 15 years. But he was the one in the chair. Vera arrived 40 minutes later. She had been called by the hospital. Her number was in Dmitry's phone, listed first under a contact name that was simply Mama, and the nurse who had located it had called at 6:58 a.m. Vera had been awake. She'd been awake since 4 in the morning when the calls she'd made to Dmitry's phone had gone unanswered, and awake before that in the way she'd been awake most nights since November. And she arrived in the corridor with her coat misbuttoned and her hair not fully arranged, and looked at the man in the chair and recognised him from a version of his face she had last seen when she was 34 years old. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Vera sat in the chair beside him, and they waited together, in the specific silence of two people for whom words had not yet caught up with what was happening. Dr. Baranoff came at 8:45. He explained the situation in the measured, information-dense way of a physician who has learned that people in this corridor need facts more than comfort, because comfort without facts is just noise and people can hear the difference. He described the cardiac event, the resuscitation, the current rhythm irregularity, the ICU monitoring protocol. He used the phrase, waiting to see how the next 24 hours develop 3 times, because that was the accurate phrase and accuracy was what he had. He didn't mention Mephedrone in the hallway. That conversation happened in his office separately, with both of them present, with the toxicology results on his desk, a printed sheet that Vera looked at for a long time, and Gennady looked at and then looked away from. Vera had found the packets under the sink. She had read the search results. She had known what she was reading for 3 months and had carried that knowledge through every locked door and every plate left in the hallway, and every night of lying awake in the dark, alone with information she didn't know how to act on. The toxicology sheet confirmed nothing she hadn't already understood. What it added was the specific concentration, a number that Dr. Baranoff described carefully as consistent with very heavy sustained use over an extended period. Extended. He said the word and let it sit there. Now comes the thing that happened on February 1st, the day before the night of the cardiac arrest, the event that this entire account has been carrying without opening. On the afternoon of February 1st, Dmitry had gone to the warehouse. Not for a shift, on a day off, in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual enough that the security guard at the entrance had logged it with a note. He had gone to find Yegor. He had found him in the loading bay office, the small glass-walled room overlooking the dock where Yegor handled scheduling and paperwork during the day. Dmitry had gone in and closed the door. What was said in that room was witnessed by no one. The security camera covering the loading bay had been redirected to face the exterior dock 6 weeks earlier, a maintenance adjustment that had never been reversed. What the security log shows is that Dmitry entered the loading bay office at 2:17 p.m. and left at 2:49 p.m., 32 minutes. What happened after he left is visible. He walked to the bus stop, rode to his apartment, went inside, and did not come out again for the rest of February 1st or the night that followed. The neighbour Raisa, passing his door at 9 in the evening on an errand, heard music playing inside, not loud but present, the kind of music that fills a room when someone is trying to fill a room. By 2:42 in the morning, the music had stopped. What happened in those 32 minutes with Yegor is a question with no available answer. But Dmitry left that office and went home, and used more than he had used in a single session across the entire preceding 11 months, and the amount left in the third packet on the kitchen table, the one that was not empty, suggests that what he used was enough to push a cardiovascular system that had been running at its limit for months, past the point from which it could return on its own. The sequence is not a mystery. The cause is not a mystery. What exists inside the 32 minutes is a mystery, and it will remain one, because the only 2 people who were in that room are not talking about it, and one of them nearly didn't survive to have the option. In the ICU, Dmitry was sedated through most of February 3rd and into February 4th. His heart rhythm stabilized slowly, not to normal, but to a version of abnormal that the cardiologist on the case, a Dr. Fedotova, described as manageable, which is a word with a very specific weight when applied to the heart of a 24-year-old. She ordered an echocardiogram. The results showed what sustained mephedrone use had accomplished over 11 months to a cardiac muscle that had started the year healthy. Reduced ejection fraction, meaning the heart was pumping at significantly diminished capacity. Mild cardiomyopathy, meaning structural change to the muscle itself. And electrical remodeling of the pathways that controlled rhythm, meaning the arrhythmia was not a temporary reaction to an acute overdose but a permanent feature of the cardiac landscape going forward. Dr. Fedotova presented these findings to Vera in a meeting on February 5th. Gennady was still there. He was still in Perm, still sleeping on a fold-out cot in Vera's apartment, which was an arrangement that had required no negotiation because the alternative had simply not presented itself as viable. He sat in the meeting too. The findings meant the following, in practical terms. Dmitry's heart now functioned at approximately 55% of its pre-event capacity. He could not perform physically demanding work. He could not sustain the cardiovascular stress of night shift labour. He could not drink caffeine in normal quantities. He could not run. He was 24 years old. He was alive. Both of these facts occupied the same space without resolving each other. Dmitry was brought out of sedation on February 5th in the late afternoon. He was aware, his cognition intact, his responses appropriate, his ability to track and respond to information unimpaired. The brain had survived the hypoxic window without measurable deficit, which Dr. Baranov described as fortunate, and which was, by the mathematics of the event, genuinely unlikely. He lay in the ICU bed and looked at the ceiling and did not ask for his phone. This was the first thing Alina noticed when she came on shift that evening, that he hadn't asked for his phone, which is almost always the first thing patients his age ask for when consciousness returns, the reaching for the device as a way of anchoring back to the life outside the room. He didn't reach for it. He looked at the ceiling. Alina checked his chart. She reviewed the intake information, age, presenting symptoms, toxicology results, the resuscitation log with its compression count. She found his name. She found his date of birth. She cross-referenced it with a habit she had developed over months of working in this ward, the habit of checking whether a patient had been seen before at this facility. He had been seen before. October 28th, 2025. Walk-in clinic, ground floor. Presenting complaint. Persistent headache. Elevated heart rate 98 beats per minute. Elevated blood pressure. Standard tox panel ordered and returned negative. Discharge note from the attending physician. No acute findings. Ibuprofen prescribed. Caffeine reduction advised. And below that, in the nurse's intake notes, in handwriting she recognised as her own. Patient appears anxious. Consider follow-up. She stood at the nursing station and read the October entry twice. Then she put the chart down, went to the staff bathroom at the end of the corridor, and stood at the sink with the water running for approximately 2 minutes. This is not documented anywhere. It is what happened. When she came back to the nursing station, she picked up the green notebook from her left scrub pocket. She still carried it, the rubber band still around it, now filling its third page of entries, and opened it to a blank line and wrote the date and his name and the presenting details and the outcome: survived resuscitation, ICU, cardiac damage, prognosis guarded. Then she wrote in smaller letters below the entry the words she'd written in October without knowing what they would mean. Consider follow-up. She closed the notebook. The question that does not close here, the one that will stay with Alina Sorokina for longer than this story has space to document, is whether the outcome of February 3rd was inevitable from the moment the October tox panel returned negative, or whether a different panel, a different flag, a different follow-up appointment scheduled rather than suggested would have changed the trajectory of the 11 months that followed. It is a question without a clean answer. The system did what it was designed to do. What it was designed to do was not enough. And in the ICU bed, Dmitry Volkov was looking at the ceiling, alive, with a heart that would never again work the way it had worked before. In a city where the channel with 1,700 subscribers was still posting, and the man whose name had been removed from a list was still supervising night shifts on Promyshlenaya Street, and somewhere on the E22 highway right now, tonight, a truck from Trans-Ural was moving through the dark toward its next destination. Dmitry was discharged from Perm City Hospital No. 4 on February 12, 2026. 9 days in the ICU and cardiac ward. 9 days of monitors and blood draws in the specific institutional rhythm of a place that runs on 6-hour intervals. Vitals, medications, chart notes, the shift change at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. when one set of faces replaced another, and the patient in the bed had to re-establish wordlessly which version of himself he was presenting to the new arrival. He was cooperative. He answered questions accurately. He did not ask to leave early. He went home to Vera's apartment, not his own, where the lights had been left on, and the table still held the glass and the packets, which Vera had cleared and cleaned before he returned, scrubbing the table with the thoroughness of someone trying to remove something that isn't entirely physical. His bedroom door no longer had the bolt. Vera had removed it while he was in the hospital, working the screws out with a butter knife because she didn't own a screwdriver, leaving 4 small holes in the doorframe that she filled with toothpaste and painted over badly with leftover wall paint that didn't quite match. He noticed the holes. He said nothing about them. Gennady stayed for 11 days total. He slept on the fold-out cot in the living room, ate Vera's food without comment, and moved through the small apartment with the careful minimalism of a man trying to occupy the least possible space. He and Dmitry did not have the conversation that the situation seemed to call for. They did not discuss the text message, or the 19 days of silence, or the 15 years before that. What they did was exist in the same rooms, passing each other in the hallway, watching the same television programs in the evenings without speaking about them, and occasionally sitting at the kitchen table with tea while the radiator knocked against the cold outside. On the 8th day, Gennady fixed the kitchen tap that had been dripping since October. He found the tools in the cabinet under the sink, Vera's late father's tools, untouched for years, and spent 40 minutes on his knees on the kitchen floor replacing a washer while the television played in the background. When he was done, he ran the water to test it, dried his hands on a dish towel, and put the tools back exactly where he'd found them. He did not make an event of it. Neither did anyone else. On day 11, he drove back to Yekaterinburg. He said he would come back. Whether that was a fact or an intention was not something anyone in the apartment could have determined with certainty, and no one tried. The cardiac damage was permanent. Dr. Fedotova had been clear about this, and the follow-up appointment on February 19th confirmed what the echocardiogram had shown. The 55% ejection fraction was not a temporary reading skewed by the acute event, but a stable measurement of a heart that had been structurally altered. It would not improve significantly. It might deteriorate further. The variables governing which direction it moved were partially within Dmitry's control. No stimulants, no sustained physical stress, regular monitoring, and partially not. He was prescribed 3 medications. 2 were for cardiac rhythm stabilization. 1 was for blood pressure. He would take all 3 for the foreseeable future, which Dr. Fedotova declined to put a time limit on. He was 24 years old. He filled the prescriptions at the pharmacy 2 blocks from Vera's apartment on a Tuesday morning, standing in line behind an elderly woman buying compression stockings and a man in his 60s refilling something for blood sugar. The pharmacist gave him the 3 boxes in a white paper bag. He carried it home. He put the boxes in the bathroom cabinet in a row, by size, the way he organised everything. The question of whether he would use again was present in every room he entered without being spoken in any of them. Dr. Fedotova had referred him to an addiction specialist at the hospital's outpatient unit, a requirement in his discharge paperwork, not optional. The specialist, a Dr. Milutin, was a compact, precise man in his late 40s who'd been working in addiction medicine in Perm for 19 years, and who had the particular quality of someone who stopped being surprised a long time ago and replaced surprise with something more useful. He saw Dmitry twice in February. He assessed dependency, physical withdrawal status, and psychological risk factors using a standardized instrument and his own considerable experience. He told Dmitry, in direct terms, what the continued use of Mephedrone would do to a cardiac system already operating at reduced capacity. The word he used was not dangerous. He used a more specific word. The specific word was unsurvivable. Dmitry listened. He nodded at appropriate intervals. He answered every question honestly, which Dr. Milutin noted in his file, because it was not always what he encountered. On the way out of the second appointment, Dmitry stopped in the corridor and stood still for approximately 30 seconds, not looking at anything specific, then walked to the bus stop and rode home. He did not use in February. March arrived, and something else happened that this story has been carrying since November. A journalist named Svetlana Baranova worked for a Perm-based independent news outlet called Zvezda Perm that operated primarily online, with a readership of approximately 40,000 people and a budget that required its 3 full-time staff members to be their own photographers, editors, and social media managers simultaneously. Baranova was 38 years old and had been covering the drug situation in Perm for 2 years, not as an assigned beat, but as a story she had chosen personally, filed alongside everything else, driven by the specific professional restlessness of a journalist who has noticed a pattern that the official record keeps failing to document. She had covered Pavel Grishin's death in December with the 4-sentence item that received 63 views. She had covered 2 other deaths in January in similarly brief form, because without official confirmation of cause or access to toxicology records, which required either a family willing to share them or a source inside the forensic pathology unit, she could not write the longer piece the pattern demanded. In the second week of March 2026, she received an email. The sender used an anonymous address, a string of characters, no name. The message contained 3 attachments. The first was a scan of the original 7-name list from Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov's investigation of Transural LLC, the unredacted version, the one with Yegor's name present and 2 others she didn't immediately recognize but would, within 48 hours of research, connect to the supply chain above the Telegram channel. The second attachment was the meeting minutes from the September 2024 review, sparse but time-stamped, showing that the file had been reviewed and the review had taken 22 minutes. The third was a photograph of the final closed file with its 4-name list, held next to the original 7-name list. The difference visible and undeniable. The email had no message in the body. No context, no instruction, no request. Just the 3 attachments and a timestamp showing it had been sent at 2:14 in the morning. Baranova read the attachments. Then she called a contact at the Interior Ministry press office and submitted a formal information request for the Trans-Ural case file. Case number, dates, basis for closure. The press office acknowledged the request. The statutory response period under Russian information law was 30 days. She also called a source she had been cultivating for 14 months, a person whose position gave them access to the filing systems of the organised crime unit, and whose name will not appear in this account. The source confirmed, in terms careful enough to be usable, that the case file existed, that it had been closed in October 2024, and that the individual originally named as the primary suspect in on-site distribution was still employed at the warehouse in a supervisory capacity. Still employed. Supervisor. Baranova published her first piece on March 14th. Cautious, documented, built on the information she could verify and nothing more. She didn't name Yegor directly. She described a case file, a closure, a pattern of synthetic cathinon deaths in Perm, and the gap between what the investigation had found and what action had followed. She linked the deaths, Grishin, the 2 in January, 3 others she had documented across late 2025, to a supply network operating through encrypted channels that the relevant enforcement unit had identified and not disrupted. The piece received 4,000 views on the first day, then 11,000, then shared through a Telegram channel dedicated to Perm local news, 37,000. The Interior Ministry's press office called Baranova's editor at 5 p.m. on March 15th to clarify that the case file referenced in the article had been closed in accordance with standard procedural criteria, and that any suggestion of impropriety was without evidentiary foundation. The statement was delivered by a spokesperson named in the call log. It was published as a response at the bottom of Baranova's piece. It received more attention than the denial. On March 17th, Baranova received a second email from the same anonymous address. This one had no attachments. It contained 4 words in Russian that translate approximately as the highway patrol logs. She pulled every traffic enforcement log from the E22 highway involving vehicles registered to or contracted by Transural LLC between January 2025 and January 2026. Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov's name appeared 41 times as issuing officer, more than any other officer on that stretch by a significant margin. On one log entry, in the notes field, a license plate number had been written in a hand slightly different from the standard printed form, as if added after the fact carefully by someone making sure it would be findable. The plate traced to a Transural delivery vehicle. The date of the log entry was February 3rd, 2025, 11 months before Dmitry's cardiac arrest. The cargo manifest number matched a shipment that, cross-referenced with Transural's publicly filed freight records, showed a route originating in Chelyabinsk, the same city where Ovchinnikov's financial analysis had traced the supply chain's manufacturing source. Ovchinnikov had been leaving a trail, from traffic enforcement, 1 log at a time, over 11 months, with the patience of someone who understood that he had been removed from the investigation but had not been told to stop noticing things. The Interior Ministry did not respond to Baranova's second information request, filed on March 19th, which asked specifically about the reassignment of Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov and the basis for that decision. Yegor remained employed at Transural LLC as of the date of Baranova's third piece, published March 28th. The piece was read by 112,000 people. It named him. His employment status did not change in the 2 weeks following publication that fall within the timeline of this account. The formal information request filed by Baranova in March, the one with a statutory 30-day response window, returned on April 14th. The document provided was the closed version of the case file. The list of names contained 4 entries. The redactions were heavy, applied with a kind of thoroughness that suggests not bureaucratic routine but specific intent. The reason for closure remained unspecified. In Vera's apartment, Dmitry was learning what his body could and couldn't do at 55% cardiac capacity. He could walk, he could ride the bus, he could sit at a desk. He couldn't climb the 4 flights of stairs to the apartment without stopping once on the 3rd landing to let his heart rate return to a range his new medications could manage. He stood on that landing every time and looked out the small window at the Sverdlovsky district below. The familiar roof lines, the bus stop, the pharmacy 2 blocks away, the specific grey of a Perm sky that never quite decided whether it was clearing or thickening. He had not returned to Transural. He had not been fired. Technically, he was on extended medical leave, a status that his employment paperwork supported and that no one at the company had yet moved to change, possibly because changing it would require documentation that referenced the circumstances of his hospitalization, which would reference the toxicology results, which would reference the substance, which would reference the workplace, which no one at Transural appeared eager to document. He was receiving a fraction of his normal salary under the medical leave provision. It was not enough. He had applied for 2 jobs in March. Both required physical capability assessments he couldn't pass. The third application, a remote data entry position with a freight company based in Kazan, was under review. Ruslan came on a Saturday in late March, the first time he and Dmitry had been in the same room since October. He brought food, the kind of specific, unnecessary amount of food that people bring when they don't know what else to do, and sat across from Dmitry at the kitchen table while Vera made tea. He looked at Dmitry the way he'd looked at him across the cafe table in October, the same measuring attention, the same careful filing. What he found was different. The overbrightness in the eyes was gone, the jaw still sharp from the weight he hadn't yet regained, but the stillness in the hands was a different kind of stillness now, not the stillness of suppression, but of something quieter. They talked about Ruslan's job, about a film they'd both watched at some point and disagreed about nothing important, for 2 hours, at a kitchen table in a Perm apartment while the radiator knocked and Vera's tea went slightly cold. At the end of the visit, at the door, Ruslan said something brief that Dmitry listened to without responding immediately. Then he nodded, once. Then Ruslan left. What Ruslan said is not the last thing in this story, but it is close to it. Because the question that every person in this account has been circling, Vera at the kitchen table, Gennady on the fold-out cot, Dr. Milutin in his office, Alina at the nursing station, is the one that has no clean answer and no closing date. Whether Dmitry Volkov, on a Tuesday morning in April or May or June, will open a message on an encrypted app and place an order, or whether the 55% will be enough to hold the line against the thing that the brain, recalibrated and incomplete, is still quietly asking for. He doesn't know. The green notebook in Alina Sorokina's left scrub pocket had 61 entries by the end of March. The last 4 were new, all 4 were employed males under 32. All 4 had presented from night shift industrial work environments. 3 of them had never been seen at any medical facility before the night they arrived in her ward. The departmental meeting where the panel update had been discussed finally generated an action item in February, a recommendation to share the updated Cathanon testing protocol with 3 other Perm facilities. The recommendation was approved. Implementation was pending budget confirmation. Pending. And on the E22 highway tonight, if you drove east out of Perm toward Yekaterinburg in the dark, you would pass trucks, many trucks, their running lights orange in the black, their manifests logged by someone at a dispatch desk somewhere, their cargo moving between cities that are 400 kilometers apart and connected by a road that runs straight through the Ural foothills without apology. Some of those trucks belong to Transural LLC. Yegor signed their departure logs this morning. The heart monitor in resuscitation room 3 of Perm City Hospital number 4 had been screaming for 4 minutes when the nurse began counting compressions out loud. 87, 88, 89. Now the viewer knows what those numbers mean. The young man on the gurney was Dmitry Volkov, 24 years old. A logistics dispatcher who kept a handwritten log alongside a digital system that crashed twice a month, who rode the night bus home at 6 in the morning, who had weighed 71 kilograms in March and 58 in February, who had sent 4 words to a man 420 kilometers away and waited 19 days for an answer that didn't come. The nurse counting compressions was Alina Sorokina, who had seen him once before in October and written 2 words in his file that she would carry forward from this night in ways the file would never fully capture. The man in the plastic chair in the hallway was Dmitry Volkov, still in his coat, still holding the cold of the E22 highway in the fabric, having driven through the Ural dark not because anyone told him to, but because 19 days had become the outer limit of what his silence could hold. Everything in the opening scene of this story was true. Every detail was accurate. The gurney, the monitor, the counting, the hallway, the plastic chair, the coat, the torn paper packet on the floor of an apartment 3 kilometers away. All of it exactly as described. What has changed is not the facts. What has changed is the weight of them. The folded paper packet on the floor of Dmitry's apartment was not the beginning of something. It was near the end. The beginning was 11 months earlier, on a desk in a warehouse on Promyshlenaya Street, placed there by a man who knew exactly what it was and described it as vitamins, and who is still, today, this week, this morning, signing departure logs for trucks that roll out onto the E22 before dawn. The beginning was also a police file opened in March 2024 by a man who was good at his job and was reassigned to a highway for being good at it. It was a September meeting that lasted 22 minutes and produced no minutes worth reading. It was a toxicology panel designed in the early 2000s that couldn't detect a drug dominating the 2020s. It was a memo sent at 11:47 p.m. and acknowledged 30 days after the meeting it was written for. It was a budget confirmation still pending. It was a list of 7 names that became 4. It was a 9-year-old boy who never asked his father why he left. The beginning is not locatable at a single point. It is distributed across systems and silences and decisions that each made individual sense, and collectively produced a young man on a gurney with a nurse counting his compressions at 2:40 in the morning. Compression 127 was not a miracle. It was arithmetic, the result of a team that didn't stop, a paramedic who ordered the right test, a doctor who updated a panel without waiting for a committee, and a woman who had been carrying a green notebook in her left scrub pocket for 11 months and filling it with names and dates because someone had to write them down somewhere. 127, not a symbol, a number. The specific, unglamorous, physical count of the times a team pushed their hands into the chest of a person and refused to stop until the monitor gave them a reason. Dmitry Volkov is alive. He stands on the 3rd-floor landing of his mother's building every day, on the way up, and waits for his heart to settle. He looks out the small window at the Sverdlovsky district, the roof lines, the bus stop, the pharmacy, the grey sky. He has done this every day since February 12th. He will do it tomorrow. The landing has become, without ceremony, the place where he takes the measure of what remains, what the body can do now, what it will be asked to do next, what the distance is between those two things on any given Tuesday morning in Perm in 2026. He has not used since the night of February 2nd. That is 41 days as of the date this account closes. 41 days is not a resolution, Doctor. Milutin would be the first to say so, and does say so, in their weekly outpatient appointments where Dmitry continues to arrive on time and answer every question honestly. 41 days is 41 days, significant, not permanent, requiring the same maintenance tomorrow that it required today. The Kazan-based freight company offered him the remote data entry position on March 22nd. He accepted. The work begins April 7th. It pays less than Trans-Ural. It requires only a laptop and a reliable internet connection, both of which exist in Vera's apartment, he will work days. Gennady called on March 30th. Not a long call, 20 minutes. He asked about the job and the medications and the appointment with Dr. Milutin. Dmitry answered all 3 questions. Before the call ended, Gennady said something that took him a long time to say. Audibly long, the kind of pause that has the weight of years in it. And Dmitry listened to it without filling the silence. What Gennady said will remain between them. What followed it was a date. A weekend in April, Gennady driving to Perm. No occasion, just a date. Dmitry wrote it on a piece of paper and put it on the kitchen table where he could see it. Alina Sorokina filed an updated version of her November memo in March. Longer this time, more documented, citing the 61 notebook entries by category and date and outcome, and attaching Baranova's published pieces as external corroboration of the pattern she'd been recording from the inside. She sent it to Dr. Chesnokov, to the hospital's administrative director, and, for the first time stepping outside the internal chain, to the Perm Regional Health Authority's Public Health Division. The health authority acknowledged receipt on March 28th. No further response had arrived by the time this account closes. The green notebook is almost full. She bought a second one, identical, 30 rubles, rubber band included, and put it in her left scrub pocket on the 1st of April. She has not yet written in it. She's hoping, in the way that people in her position learn to hope, practically without expectation, as a form of professional maintenance rather than optimism, that she won't need to fill it as fast as she filled the first one. She will probably fill it faster. Senior Lieutenant Ovchinnikov is still working traffic enforcement on the E22. He has made no further public moves. The 41 log entries with his name on them are in Baranova's possession. Whether they become the next piece, or the piece after that, or something that requires more documentation before it can be published without legal exposure, that is a calculation Baranova is running in the same practical, resource-limited way she runs everything at a 3-person outlet with 40,000 readers and no legal fund. She's still working the story. That much is certain. The Telegram channel that served Perm's supply network had 1,700 subscribers in May 2025. By April 2026, following Baranova's March pieces and the attention they generated, the channel had gone dark. The account deleted, the message history vanished, the administrator identities dispersed back into the encrypted architecture that had always protected them. The supply did not stop. It moved. A new channel, different name, same district numbering system, had 2,300 subscribers by the end of March. 2,300 in Perm alone. Pavel Grishin, the 26-year-old delivery driver who died in his apartment in November and whose death appeared in 4 sentences on a regional news site, was buried in the Severnoy Cemetery on the northern edge of Perm on December 15th. His mother, a woman named Natalia Grishina, attended Baranova's public talk at the Perm Public Library on March 25th, an event organised after the third piece, attended by 211 people, standing room only, the fire code technically exceeded by 31. Natalia sat in the second row. She brought the 4-sentence news item printed on a piece of paper. After the talk, she handed it to Baranova and didn't say anything. Baranova kept it. It is in the folder on her desk where she keeps the things that remind her why the calculation is worth running. The paper packet that Raisa's emergency call, and 9 minutes of paramedic response time, and 127 compressions, and Dr. Chesnokov's unilateral panel update, and Alina's green notebook all conspired, in their separate ways, to make survivable. That packet was collected as evidence by the responding officers, logged and stored. It is in the chain of custody system of the Perm Interior Ministry. In the same building, 4 floors up, in a filing cabinet with a string closure wrapped around a circular tab, is a manila folder with a case number and a closure stamp, and a list of 4 names where there were once 7. Both documents are in that building right now. They have never been in the same room. And somewhere in Perm tonight, not metaphorically, not approximately, but specifically, in a real apartment in a real district with a real name, a night shift worker is finishing a shift that has gone 2 hours long. He's 22, or 27, or 31. He's been awake since yesterday afternoon. He has a dispatch desk or a delivery route or a factory floor, and the thing keeping him functional through the last 2 hours of it is something he was offered 6 weeks ago by someone he had worked beside for long enough to trust, someone who called it vitamins, someone who knew exactly what it was and knew exactly that he would need it again before he thought to ask what it was. He doesn't know what it is yet. He will find out the way Dmitry found out, from a search engine, in a break room, reading a page he will understand completely and then put away. And in resuscitation room 3, the gurney is empty now, clean, waiting. The monitor is off. The counter is reset. The room doesn't know what it held at 2:40 in the morning. Rooms don't carry that. Only people do. The ones who are in them, counting, and the ones who weren't there and drove 420 kilometers through the dark anyway because 4 words arrived 19 days ago and silence had finally run out of room. Dad. Can we meet sometime? The blue check marks were there. The answer wasn't. Until midnight on February 2nd, when a man put on a coat he forgot to take off and walked to his car in the Ekaterinburg cold and drove toward a city and a sun and a plastic chair that were already waiting, in the way that things wait for decisions that took too long, without judgment, without impatience, simply present, simply there. The compression count was 127. The team didn't stop. That is the only reason this sentence exists. And tonight, on the E22, the trucks are moving. The running lights are orange in the black. The manifests are logged. The departure logs are signed. The channel has 2,300 subscribers, and somewhere in its queue, a message is being composed. A price, a quantity, a district number, a time window, the same as always, frictionless and invisible and already on its way. The room is ready. The counter is at 0.